My name is Sofia Bianchi, and I was standing waist-deep in freezing water, holding on to the man I had hated for a year, when I finally understood why he had never once asked me what was wrong. His name was Dante Castellano, a mafia boss wrapped in tailored silence, shipping contracts, and the kind of stillness that made senators check their tone before they finished a sentence. I worked for him at Castellano Maritime, the legal face of an empire everyone pretended was ordinary. On paper, I was his contracts director. In reality, I was the woman who read every clause twice, caught every buried liability, and stood 2 steps behind him in every room that mattered. I knew his ports, his shipping manifests, his silent partners, his quiet threats dressed as courtesy. I also knew one thing with total certainty. Dante Castellano did not care what happened to the people who worked for him as long as the numbers arrived on time. I learned that 14 months earlier, on the night my sister Mia's kidneys finally failed. I stood in his office with my hands shaking around my phone, the hospital's numbers still glowing on the screen, and asked him for one thing: a single day off and an advance against my salary so I could get to the transplant list faster. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry in front of him. I said, "Mr. Castellano, my sister may not survive the month without this." The office had gone very quiet. Outside the window, the harbor lights blurred through glass I would remember for the rest of my life. One of the 3 men near the window, a heavy-set captain named Bruno, who had never once looked directly at me in 2 years, shifted his weight, watching. I understood. Even then, on some instinctive level I hadn't yet found words for, that this was a performance as much as an answer, that whatever Dante said next was for the room as much as for me. I did not understand it enough to forgive it. Not that night, kneeling later on a hospital bathroom floor with my phone pressed to my ears, listening to a nurse explain transplant waiting lists in a voice trained to sound gentler than the news actually was. He looked at me across his desk, 3 of his men standing near the window, and said, "Family emergencies do not pause board timelines. We sign in the morning. Be at your desk." That sentence did not just hurt me. It rearranged something inside my chest permanently. Mia survived because a transplant slot opened 2 weeks later, and an anonymous account covered the balance the insurance refused. I never connected that miracle to him. Why would I? Dante Castellano had already shown me exactly what kind of man he was. From that night forward, I gave him flawless work, a spine made of ice, and a hatred so disciplined it looked, from the outside, almost like loyalty. Now, 14 months later, I stood in a stairwell on the 11th floor of Castellano Tower 40 minutes before a board meeting, pressing the heel of my hand against my eyes so the mascara wouldn't run, breathing through the kind of fear that has a schedule. This was the 7th time in 4 months. Every time the board convened to review shipping manifests, Nico called first. Every time Nico called, I went to the stairwell, because the elevator had cameras and the stairwell, for one flight only, did not. Every time I hung up, I cried for 90 seconds exactly, because that was all I could afford, and then I fixed my face and went back to being the woman who read every clause twice. "You have 3 minutes before Castellano notices your absence," Nico's voice would say. Calm, reasonable, the voice of a man who had once proposed to me with a ring he'd chosen because it photographed well. Just the loading schedule for the Halden route. "That's all I need this time, Sofia. You know what happens to Mia's coverage if the Alvaro group stops receiving what they're owed." I did not ask why the man who ran Meridian Continuing Care, the private long-term facility where my sister lived after her transplant, needed shipping schedules for a rival family's operation. I had asked, the first time, 11 months ago. Nico had smiled the way he used to smile across a dinner table and said, "Some debts follow the body, Sofia. Mia's file says she needs specialized post-transplant monitoring for the next 6 years. That monitoring is a privilege I can extend, or a paperwork error I can discover. Your choice every month for 6 years." It had started small 4 months earlier. The first time, Nico had only wanted a shipping insurance policy number, something I told myself was harmless, a formality he needed for Mia's coverage paperwork. I gave it to him in the stairwell, cried for the 90 seconds after, and told myself it was the last time. The second time, 3 weeks later, he wanted a delivery date. The third time, a manifest. By the fifth call, standing on that same landing in November with sleet ticking against the window above the fire door, I finally asked him outright what any of it had to do with Mia's care at all. "Everything," he'd said, in the same reasonable voice he used to use to book restaurant reservations. And nothing. That's the part you still haven't understood, Sofia. It stopped being about her file months ago. It's about what you're willing to do to keep it closed. I had gone back to my desk that day and signed 4 contracts without reading a single clause twice, something I had never once done in 3 years at Castellano Maritime, and no one had noticed, because no one was looking closely enough to notice, including, I told myself bitterly, the man whose office door I passed twice a day without him ever once asking if I was all right. That morning, on the 11th floor, I finished my 90 seconds, wiped my face, and did not know that Dante Castellano was standing one landing above me, on the stairs, absolutely still, listening. I found out 3 days later, the way I found out most things about him, too late and from the wrong angle. We were in the back of an armored car on the coast road to Porto Vela, where Castellano Maritime was signing a shipping alliance with a Greek consortium that would triple the company's legitimate freight volume and quietly launder the illegitimate half of it for the next decade. I had the contract binder open on my knees. Dante sat across from me in a charcoal coat, reading the same pages upside down out of some old habit of double-checking his own lawyers, which I had always found insulting and, if I was honest, slightly reassuring. "You've been late to 3 meetings this quarter," he said without looking up, "and early to none. I've never missed a deadline." "That's not what I asked." I closed the binder halfway. "Is there a clause in my contract about punctuality I haven't read?" "There's a clause about honesty. You wrote it yourself for the vendor agreements. Full disclosure of material facts, or the agreement is void." His eyes came up to mine, dark, unreadable, entirely too observant for a man I had spent a year convincing myself didn't see me at all. "Are you going to tell me what's wrong, Sofia? Or should I assume it's none of my business, the way you clearly want me to?" The car hit a pothole. I used the small jolt as an excuse to look out the window instead of at him. "It's nothing you'd understand," I said. "You don't pause for emergencies. You told me that yourself." Something crossed his face, fast enough that I almost missed it, gone before I could name it. He didn't answer. He never did when I brought up that night. He just went quiet in the particular way that made his silence feel like a locked door instead of an empty room. Outside, the coast road wound between cliffs on one side and dense pine on the other, sunlight flashing off the water in a rhythm I'd have found beautiful under any other circumstance. Enzo caught my eye once in the rearview mirror, the way he always did when the air in the back seat turned tense, a small private reassurance that had nothing to do with words. I hadn't known then that it would be the last time I ever saw him do it. We didn't speak again until the ambush. It happened 40 minutes from Porto Vela, on the narrow coast road where the cliffs dropped straight into the sea on one side and dense pine forest climbed the hills on the other. I remember the sound before I understood it, a flat crack that didn't belong to the ocean, followed by the driver's door taking a hit that spiderwebbed the reinforced glass. "Down," Dante said, and his hand was already on the back of my neck, pressing me below the window line before my brain had finished processing the word gunfire. The car swerved hard. Metal screamed against the guardrail. I saw in the fractured second the window cracked further, a black SUV closing fast in the side mirror, two men leaning out with rifles braced against the frame, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that this had never been about the Greek consortium at all. "They knew our route," I said, voice strange and flat even to my own ears. "They knew exactly which road." "I noticed," Dante said grim, both hands on the seat in front of him now, bracing. Two more shots hit the rear panel, and the driver, Enzo, a quiet man who always brought me coffee before I asked, shouted something in Sicilian dialect I only half caught, something about the boat, get to the boat, and then the car was skidding sideways across gravel that gave way to nothing. We went over the edge of the access road toward the marina below. Not falling, exactly, more like sliding down a controlled disaster. Enzo fighting the wheel the entire way, until the car crunched to a stop against a low sea wall 30 feet above the water. "Out now," Dante said, already moving, already pulling the door handle on my side because mine had jammed. Another round of gunfire hit the car's frame. I felt the vibration of it through the seat. "Enzo!" "Enzo is going to hold the road," Dante said, and something in his voice told me not to ask what that meant. "Sofia, now." He half carried me down the rocks toward the small private dock where a single speedboat waited, engine already idling because someone, his men, I would learn later, men who were now dead or dying on the road above us, had prepared it for exactly this kind of exit. We were 40 yards offshore when the first bullet hit the boat's hull. "They're not trying to stop the deal," I said, gripping the rail, salt spray stinging the cut on my cheek I hadn't noticed getting. "They're trying to stop me." Dante's head turned sharply. "What?" "The Alvaro group. They wanted the Halden shipping schedule. I gave it to them 3 days ago because Nico said." The rest of the sentence disappeared into the roar of the engine as Dante cut hard across the water. But I saw his face change, saw the exact moment understanding replaced confusion, and I braced for the fury I knew was coming. It didn't come the way I expected. "Who is Nico?" he said, flat, controlled, terrifyingly calm. "And what does he have on you?" Before I could answer, the second boat appeared behind us, faster, lower in the water, gaining. Dante swore in a language I didn't recognize and pushed the throttle to its limit, the hull slamming against the waves hard enough to bruise. I grabbed the seat with both hands. The coastline blurred past, jagged and unfamiliar, and then the engine coughed once, twice, and died completely, a bullet finally finding something vital in the motor housing. We drifted, powerless, toward a line of black rocks half a mile from a stretch of empty coast. "Brace," Dante said, and put his body between me and the console a half second before we hit. The impact threw me sideways into the water, cold enough to stop my heart for 1 full second before instinct took over and I fought toward the surface, lungs burning, salt in my mouth, the boat's shattered hull scraping past my shoulder in the dark water. A hand closed around my wrist and pulled, hard, and I broke the surface gasping into Dante Castellano's face. Blood running from a cut above his eyebrow, his coat gone, his shirt torn open at the collar, both of us treading water in the wreckage of everything I thought I understood about my life. "Swim," he said. "Now, rocks, then the beach. I'm behind you." He was not behind me. I found that out the second I dragged myself onto the black rocks and turned to see him, still in the water, one arm, useless at his side, blood spreading thin and pink around him, the pursuing boat's engine growing louder somewhere behind the headland. "Dante?" I said swim. His jaw was tight with something that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite command. If they round that point and see both of us on open rock, we're finished. Get to the tree line. I'll follow. I did not swim to the tree line. I went back into the water, grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt, and hauled him toward the rocks with a strength I did not know I had, cursing him the entire way in 2 languages, and he let me, which frightened me more than the gunfire had. We made it into the pines as the second boat's engine cut the water 50 yards offshore, searching, finding nothing but an empty stretch of black rock and a wrecked hull already sinking. For a long moment, we lay in the wet undergrowth, breathing hard, listening to the boat circle once, twice, and finally pull away toward the horizon. Then Dante turned his head and looked at me, blood and salt water on his face, his dark hair plastered flat, and said, in a voice stripped of every ounce of boardroom control, "Now, tell me about Nico." I told him everything. I told him about the stairwell, the 90 seconds, the phone calls that always came exactly 40 minutes before a board meeting. I told him about Meridian Continuing Care, about Mia's transplant, about the 6-year monitoring window Nico held over my sister's head like a blade on a string. I told him about the ring I'd given back 3 years ago and the promise Nico had made when I did, that he would remember, that people like him always found a way to collect. Dante listened without interrupting, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted, because it meant he was building something in his mind, brick by brick, the way he built everything. "You've been feeding shipping schedules to a rival syndicate for 11 months, he said finally. "To protect your sister's medical coverage." "Yes. And you thought I would fire you, or worse. I thought you would call it a breach of contract and let your men handle it the way you handle everything else that becomes inconvenient." My voice cracked on the last word, exhaustion and salt water, and 14 months of grief finally catching up to me all at once. "You told me family emergencies don't pause the timeline, Dante. I believed you. Why wouldn't I keep believing you?" Something moved behind his eyes, dark and old and furious, but not, I realized slowly, furious at me. "We'll discuss that sentence," he said, "when we're not bleeding in a forest." I looked at him properly then, really looked, and saw the wound in his shoulder for the first time, a clean furrow where a bullet had grazed him deep enough to need more than pressure and prayer. "You're shot. I'm aware. You've been standing there giving orders like it's a paper cut. It's usable. That is not a medical assessment. That's a personality flaw." I moved toward him before I could stop myself, tearing a strip from the hem of my ruined blouse. "Sit down before I make you." To my genuine surprise, he sat. "Enzo," I said, once the boat's engine noise had faded completely and the forest had gone quiet around us again, "do you think?" "I don't know," Dante said, and for the first time since the shooting started, something raw cracked through his composure. "He's driven for me 11 years. If that road is still hot, my men will find him. If it isn't—" He stopped. Didn't finish it, I understood. Watching his jaw work, that this was a grief he would not let himself feel yet, not while there was still a task in front of him to survive. I found the crushed remains of the boat's emergency kit tangled in my jacket and used what was left of the antiseptic to clean the gash along Dante's shoulder properly for the first time since the crash, kneeling in front of him in the wet undergrowth while he sat with his back against a fallen trunk and his eyes closed against the sting. "This is going to hurt," I said. "I've survived worse." "That's not a medical assessment. That's a personality flaw." A breath left him that wasn't quite a laugh. "Noted." I worked as gently as I could, watching his jaw tighten every time the cloth passed too close to the wound's edge. And somewhere in the careful, silent minutes of it, the anger I'd been carrying into that forest, at him, at Nico, at 14 months of stairwell landings, quieted just enough to let me see the man in front of me clearly for what might have been the first time. Not the boss, not the ledger, just a person, bleeding, trying not to let it show. "Who takes care of you when this happens?" I asked, tying off the bandage. "No one," he said. "There's never been anyone." I didn't have an answer for that yet. I only kept my hand pressed against the bandage a moment longer than necessary, and he let me, which told me more than any sentence could have. We had nothing. No phone. Mine had gone into the sea. His had shattered against the boat's console during the crash. No radio, no flare, no first he hadn't taken from the boat's emergency locker, which I'd grabbed on pure instinct as we went over. A half-crushed kit, 2 bottles of water, a folding knife, a single space blanket, and a flare gun with exactly 1 working cartridge. "How far from Porto Vela do you think we are?" I asked, pressing the strip of fabric hard against his shoulder while he held very still and did not complain, which unsettled me more than complaining would have. 12, 15 kilometers south along the coast." He nodded toward the ridge above the tree line. "No road access from here without crossing land. The Alvaro family may already be watching. We wait for dark, we move along the shoreline. We find a fishing village or a working phone." "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple, it's narrow. One task, then the next." His eyes found mine, steady despite the blood loss draining color from his face by the minute. "Panic wants the whole night at once. Survival only asks for the next hour." I stared at him, this man who had once destroyed me with a single sentence about timelines, now teaching me how to breathe through fear in a language that sounded almost gentle. "You've done this before," I said. "Once, a long time ago. My father believed comfort made men soft before it made them dead." His mouth tightened around the memory. I did not enjoy the lesson. "That sounds like something carved over a prison door." It felt like one. I woke the second morning to the sound of the tide and the terrifying absence of Dante Castellano. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. My body reached for my apartment, the radiator that clanked at 6 a.m., the smell of Mia's tea from the last time she'd stayed over before the transplant, then the pine needles under my cheek and the salt stiffening my hair dragged me back. The shelter frame stood empty beside me. The tide line had erased his footprints from the sand. "Dante?" My voice cracked over the empty beach. No answer. I hated the fear that moved through me faster than sense, hated it more than I had ever managed to hate him, because it sounded too much like need. He came out of the tree line 11 minutes later. I counted every one of them, with his good arm full of small green fruit I didn't recognize and a fistful of what turned out to be edible sea fennel. His shirt soaked through with dew, his face sharpening the second he saw me standing with a piece of driftwood, raised like a weapon. "Are you planning to murder the coastline?" he said. "Or just the man who fed you?" "I thought you'd left." Something in his expression shifted, fast, gone before I could hold on to it. "I don't leave people behind, Sofia." The sentence landed on a bruise I hadn't shown him. "Funny," I said. "I remember being left behind very clearly." He knew exactly what I meant. I saw it in the tightening at the corner of his mouth. The office? The sentence about timelines, the door he'd walked past 11 days after Mia's surgery instead of knocking. He didn't defend himself. He only crouched and split one of the strange green fruits against a rock, offering me half. "Eat," he said, "before you start hitting things with wood." "I'm not thirsty." "You're dehydrated. Your lips are cracked and you nearly went over sideways when you stood up." He held the fruit out further. "Eat, Sofia." I took it because arguing cost more energy than I had left. It was sour and strange and better than pride. We spent the morning turning survival into work, the way he seemed to turn everything into work when he didn't know what else to do with his hands. He found a narrow trickle of fresh water higher in the rocks and marked the path with strips torn from what remained of his shirt. I gathered dry brush while he tried, twice, to coax a spark from the flare gun's spent cartridge and a scrap of metal salvaged from his belt buckle. "Do Mafia bosses usually know how to start fires with a belt buckle?" I asked, watching him fail a third time. "Only the resourceful ones." Was that a joke? A small one. Do not make it emotional. I almost smiled. Almost. On the fifth attempt, a thin curl of smoke finally caught in the dry moss he'd gathered, and he leaned in and breathed on it with a patience I had genuinely never once seen him extend to anything in a boardroom, until a small flame lifted, fragile and orange, out of the gray morning. "How do you know how to do that?" I asked. His eyes stayed on the flame. "My father believed comfort made men soft before it made them dead." "You told me that already." "I know. I'm still deciding whether to tell you the rest of it." I let that sit because pushing felt for the first time like it might cost more than it earned. We built the shelter frame properly that afternoon, driftwood lashed with strips of fabric and fishing line I found tangled in the rocks, and by evening it cast real shade instead of the illusion of it. "You're better at this than a contracts director should be," he said, testing one of my knots. "I'm better at most things than I should be. It's why you hired me." "I hired you," he said, "because you found a $9 million liability buried in a Greek shipping clause that 3 senior lawyers had already signed off on. And because I was cheaper than the senior lawyers." That too. The corner of his mouth moved, quick and involuntary, and vanished before it could become dangerous. We built what shelter we could before full dark, a low frame of driftwood and pine branches wedged between 2 boulders above the tideline, useless against real weather, but enough to break the worst of the wind. Dante worked one-handed, jaw locked against pain he refused to name, and every time I told him to stop, to rest, to let his shoulder actually heal instead of tearing further, he simply looked at me and kept working, until I stopped arguing and started handing him branches instead. "You don't have to prove anything," I said, as he wedged the last support into place, breathing hard, sweat cutting clean lines through the salt and blood on his throat. "I'm not proving anything." "Then what is this?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. 14 months ago, he said finally, not looking at me. 3 men, from a family that had been circling my territory for a year, sat in my office the same week your sister went into the hospital. One of them had already turned a junior associate into an informant. I did not know how deep it went. If I had given you what you asked for that day, the leave, the advance, any visible concession, I would have confirmed for that room that Sofia Bianchi mattered to me, and men who know what matters to you know exactly where to cut. The forest went very still around us. "So you humiliated me," I said, "to protect a secret." I made a choice I believed was cleaner than the truth. It was not clean. His eyes finally came to mine, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something in Dante Castellano's face that looked almost like shame. It was cruelty wearing a strategy's clothes. I have understood that every day since. I did not know how to tell you without confirming the very thing I was trying to hide. You could have told me later, privately. "I stood outside your office door 11 days after your sister's surgery," he said, quiet, "and heard you laughing on the phone with her. Relieved, free of it for 1 hour. I told myself if I walked in, I would bring the worst week of your life back into the room with my name attached to it. So I walked away instead and called it mercy, and I have hated myself for the word ever since. I did not know what to do with that. I still hated him, in the specific, exhausted way. You hate someone you have spent a year building a wall against, brick by brick, only to watch the wall mean nothing the moment the person on the other side bleeds in front of you." "That doesn't fix 14 months, I said. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." Night came fast and cold along the coast. We shared the single space blanket because the alternative was hypothermia, and pride, I discovered, has very specific temperature limits. Dante's fever set in around midnight, low at first, then climbing, the wound in his shoulder heating under my palm no matter how much of the crushed antiseptic I pressed into it. "You're burning," I said, laying the back of my hand against his forehead. "I'm cold." "That is not how fevers work, and you know it." A weak breath that might have been a laugh escaped him. Noted. I kept the wound clean as best I could in the dark, using strips torn from my blouse, and eventually from his own ruined shirt, while he sat with his back against the boulder, and his jaw locked so tight I could see the muscle jump every time I touched the injury. "Who takes care of you?" I asked quietly. "When you're like this?" "No one sees me like this." "That's not what I asked." His eyes opened, fever-bright, less guarded than I had ever seen them. "No one," he said. "There has never been anyone." The words slid under my ribs before I could stop them. I thought of his office, his guards, his empire built brick by brick around a boy who had learned, somewhere along the way, that softness got you killed. "That sounds lonely," I said. "It's safe." "No," I said. "It's lonely. Those aren't the same thing." He stared at me the way a man stares at a sentence in a language he used to know, and had long since let himself forget, and then, fever loosening something in him that daylight and boardrooms had kept locked for years, he said, "Do not let them see softness." That's what he taught me, my father. A boss who begs is already dead. A boss who needs is already replaced. "Who told you that?" "Everyone." His voice cracked on the single word, and I pressed the damp cloth to his forehead and felt something in my own chest fold open despite every warning I had given myself in that stairwell for 11 months. This was not forgiveness. The wound from that night in his office still existed, sharp-edged and real. But hatred requires distance, and Dante Castellano was too close now, too human, too painfully, dangerously alone, and I did not know how to hold both truths in my hands at once. By morning, his fever had eased enough for him to stand, though the effort cost him visibly. We rationed the last of the water, shared the single protein bar that had survived the crash in my jacket pocket, and started south along the rocky shoreline, moving from cover to cover, avoiding the open beaches where a boat could spot us from the water. Midway through that second day, a white fishing boat appeared far out past the headland, small enough that I thought at first it was a trick of the glare on the water. I was on my knees, before I finished deciding to move, dragging my jacket off to wave it over my head, shouting until my throat tore. "Here, we're here!" Dante was beside me a second later, using the flare gun's single working cartridge, firing it high over the water in a thin red arc that hung in the sky far longer than it had any right to. The boat did not turn. It kept its slow line along the horizon, engine noise fading under the wind, until the glare swallowed it completely and the sea went back to being only sea. My arm dropped. The silence afterward felt heavier than the gunfire on the coast road had. "They didn't see us," I said, hating how small my own voice sounded. Dante's jaw was tight, his eyes still fixed on the empty horizon where the boat had been. "Then we make the next one see us." "What if there is no next one?" "There is always a next task." He looked at me, something raw moving behind the exhaustion on his face. "I am tired of tasks too, Sofia. I would like very much to stop needing to be strong about this, but not yet, not until you're safe." That honesty nearly undid me more than the missed boat had. I sat down hard on the wet rock beside him, our shoulders touching, the dead flare smoke drifting thin over the water, and for once he did not tell me what to do next. He simply sat there, breathing, exhausted enough to stop pretending, and let me be afraid beside him instead of alone. That evening, before the wind changed and the sky began its slow slide from gray to black, we sat by the small fire he'd rebuilt against a boulder, rationing the last of the sea fennel and one final strip of dried fish he'd found tangled in an old net snagged on the rocks. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down, the way it does on exposed coastline, and I found myself shivering inside my ruined blouse despite the fire. Dante noticed immediately. Of course he did. The man noticed everything except how much damage his own silences caused. He pulled off what remained of his jacket, salt-stiff and torn at one seam, and held it out across the fire. "Take it. You're injured? You need it more. You're smaller. You lose heat faster. That's not chivalry, it's physics." "I don't want your jacket, Dante." His eyes held mine across the flames. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to stay warm while you decide whether you're going to." I hated that my body wanted the jacket more than my pride wanted the distance between us. I took it with stiff fingers and pulled it around my shoulders. It smelled of salt and blood, and, underneath both, something warmer that I refused to name. I stared into the fire so I wouldn't have to look at his face. "Thank you," I said. He sat across from me, forearms bare, bandaged hand resting on his knee, and did not answer, and for a long time neither of us spoke. The fire cracked. The tide pulled back and forward against the rocks. Somewhere behind us in the dark, something moved through the brush, and neither of us reacted, too exhausted for fear to find new footing. "Why did you come back for me on the boat?" I asked finally. "Instead of swimming for the rocks like you told me to?" "Because you would have done the same for me. You already had, twice by then." "That's not an answer. That's a transaction." "No," he said. Quiet, and something in his voice had gone rougher than the fire could account for. "It stopped being a transaction somewhere on that dock, Sofia. When I realized the bullet meant for that boat's engine could just as easily have found you instead, and the only thought in my head was that I would rather it found me." I looked up at that, and the fire caught something unguarded in his face before he could put the wall back up. "Don't say things like that," I said, "if you don't mean them." I have never meant anything less lightly in my life. The second night, the storm found us. It came off the sea without warning, the sky going from gray to black in the space of an hour, wind tearing at the coastline hard enough to bend the scrub pines flat. We had reinforced the driftwood shelter as best we could that afternoon, but the first real gust tore half the frame loose, sending a length of sharpened branch flying past my head close enough that I felt the wind of it. "Move!" Dante shouted, already pulling me by the wrist toward the rock face further up the slope, where he'd spotted a shallow opening earlier that day and dismissed it as too small to bother with. We ran through sand and stinging rain, my bandaged foot screaming with every step, until my ankle rolled on a loose stone and I went down hard. Dante caught me around the waist before I hit the ground, but the motion wrenched his injured shoulder, and I heard the sound he failed to swallow, sharp and involuntary, worse than any complaint would have been. We reached the shallow sea cave half a rock face up, barely large enough for both of us, and crawled inside as the first real rain hit like thrown stones, the wind screaming past the opening loud enough to swallow every other sound. "Your shoulder," I said, once we were wedged into the dark, dripping and shaking with cold. "Later. Now Dante. Sofia." I am not asking permission. I found his hand in the dark and pressed it flat against the wound, so he could feel for himself how much heat had built beneath the bandage. "You are not allowed to die of stubbornness. I did not drag you off those rocks for that." Silence then, very quietly, noted, again, softer this time, almost fond, and something about the word in his voice undid a knot in my chest I had been carrying since the stairwell. We stayed pressed together against the cold, his good arm around me because the alternative was hypothermia for us both, and somewhere in the black hours before dawn, with the storm screaming outside and his heartbeat slower than mine but not calm. "Nothing about him was calm anymore," he said, against my hair. "That day in my office. You asked if I even thought about your sister after you left." I went very still. "Every hour," he said. "For 6 weeks until the transplant slot opened. I did not know how to tell you that without telling you everything else." "The money," I said slowly. "The account that covered what insurance wouldn't." His silence was answer enough. I pulled back far enough to see his face and the dark stormlight flickering gray across it. "That was you." "Yes. You let me hate you for 14 months, for a sentence you spent that same 14 months paying for." "Yes." "You paid it in secret," I said, "and let me stand in that stairwell every month for 11 of the 14, believing you were the reason I had to." "I did not know about the stairwell until 3 months ago. I have told you that." "You knew about the sentence, though. You knew what it cost me to hear it, every single day since, and you let it sit there instead of telling me the truth, even once you could have." "Yes." Anger and grief tangled together in my chest so tightly I couldn't separate them. "Why?" "Because the men circling my territory that year would have used her name against you the second they learned it mattered to me. I thought cruelty in public and mercy in private was the safest shape love could take in my world." His voice broke just slightly on the word love, as though he hadn't meant to use it and couldn't take it back now that the storm had heard it. "I was wrong. I know that now. I think I knew it then too, and did it anyway, because I did not trust myself to protect you any other way. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to hold on to him. I did both, in the end my fists closing in the ruined fabric of his shirt while tears I'd been rationing for 14 months finally broke free in the dark, and he let me, arm tightening around me, saying nothing, because for once there was nothing left to say that the storm hadn't already heard. Late on the 3rd afternoon, carrying an armful of driftwood toward the fire we rebuilt each time we stopped to rest, I stepped on something sharp buried under wet sand. Pain shot up through my heel, and I dropped everything with a curse that surprised even me. Dante turned so fast, the folding knife was already open in his hand before I'd finished swearing. What happened? Nothing, a shell, I think. Sit down. I can walk. I took one step and nearly folded sideways. He caught my elbow before I hit the sand, steadier than I expected from a man who'd lost half a pint of blood to a gunshot wound 3 days earlier. "You can argue with me while sitting," he said. "You enjoy giving orders to injured women. Only the stubborn ones who bleed on my beach." He guided me down onto a flat rock and, without asking permission a second time, took my ankle in both hands, careful, deliberate, as though I might shatter. The cut was shallow but ugly, sand already working its way into the wound. When his thumb brushed grit from my heel, my breath caught, sharper than the pain should have caused. "Did that hurt?" he asked, not looking up. "No." "Then why did you stop breathing?" "Your hands are cold." "My hands are not cold." "Your soul is. Maybe it spreads." He looked up at that, and for one unguarded second, something close to a real laugh moved through his face before he caught it and put it away again, the way he put everything away. He tore a clean strip from what remained of his shirt and wrapped my foot with more care than the injury strictly required. "You're running out of shirt," I said quietly. "I've survived worse losses." "Like what?" His hands stilled for half a second over the knot. "Childhood." He tied it off before I could follow the door he'd just cracked open and immediately shut again. "Do not step without watching where you put your feet." "Yes, sir." "Careful, I may start enjoying your obedience." "Do that, and I'll walk straight into the sea." He laughed then, properly, briefly, a sound so unguarded it startled both of us into silence afterward. I had never once heard Dante Castellano laugh in 14 months of working 8 feet from his office door, and something about hearing it now, cracked and rusty and real, undid a knot in my chest I hadn't known was still tied. We reached the base of the cliff trail an hour before dusk, the narrow path climbing steep above black rock and white water, the only way around the headland toward whatever settlement lay beyond it. Halfway up, my bandaged foot slid on loose stone and Dante's good arm shot out, catching my waist, pulling me hard against him before I could fall. For a moment neither of us moved. His face was inches from mine, salt drying pale in his dark hair, his breath uneven against my cheek. "Careful," he said, voice rough. "I am careful." "No, you're brave. That's different and considerably more dangerous." I couldn't look away from him. "Do you say that to all your contracts directors?" "Only the ones who pull me out of gunfire." "A fair transaction, then." "No." The answer came immediate, quiet, and far too honest. "Some debts don't balance, Sofia." His eyes dropped once to my mouth and came back up with visible effort. My hands were still flat against his chest. His arm was still locked around my waist. If I leaned even an inch closer, there would be no easy way to pretend, afterward, that it hadn't meant anything. He seemed to know it, too. "Sofia," he said, and my name in his voice sounded less like an order now and more like a warning he was giving himself. "Don't look at me like I'm better than the man who said that sentence to you 14 months ago. Then stop proving me wrong about who you actually are." For one breath, I felt him almost close the distance. I felt the pull of it, the surrender that would have come so easily after 3 days of fire and fear and honesty stripped bare by exhaustion. Then I stepped back, not because I didn't want it, because I did, more than I was ready to admit, standing on a cliff with my sister's medical file still fresh in both our minds. But because wanting him before I understood what forgiveness would actually cost me felt like another kind of falling. Dante let me go instantly. No anger, no pressure, only a shadow crossing his face before he mastered it. "You're right," he said. "About what?" "It's too soon." That gentleness nearly undid me more than the almost kiss had. On the third day, moving along a narrow cliff trail toward what Dante believed was a fishing settlement, past the next headland, my foot slipped on wet stone. I felt myself go, the drop below opening white and violent, where the waves struck rock, and then his hand closed around my wrist, and the jolt of stopping my fall tore a sound out of his ruined shoulder that he failed, for once, to swallow. "Let go of my arm," he ground out, boots scrabbling for purchase on the loose stone, his weight and mine both hanging now over 80 feet of open air. "No." "Sofia, listen to me." "No, you listen to me." My palms were slick with rain, his grip the only thing between me and the rocks below, and rage and terror made my voice steadier than it had any right to be. "You do not get to order me to let you fall after everything you just told me. Not after the money. Not after the storm. Not after 14 months I spent hating a lie you built to protect me." I found a handhold with my free arm, dug my knees into the rock, and pulled, and he pushed with everything his good arm had left. And inch by inch, pain by pain, we dragged him back onto solid stone until we both collapsed against it, shaking, alive. For a long moment, neither of us moved. "You saved me again," he said finally, breath ragged. "Stop needing it." "I'm trying. Try harder." My voice cracked around the joke and around something that wasn't a joke at all. "You do not get to fall off a cliff after making me care about you, Dante. That is not a debt I am willing to collect." He went very still beside me, catching the truth as it fell out of me before I could stop it. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the boardroom. "So you care." I looked at the sky instead of at him, because looking at him felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to sign my name to yet. "Shut up and breathe." His hand, scraped raw, found mine on the wet stone, not to move it, just to feel that I was there. We reached the fishing settlement 2 hours before dawn on the 4th day, half carrying each other down the last stretch of trail. And it was an old woman mending nets by lamplight who found us first, took one look at Dante's shoulder and my collapsed exhaustion, and simply said, in a dialect I barely followed, "Sit, I will call the doctor. Then you will tell me which one of you is going to explain the gunshot wound to the police." Neither of us explained anything to the police. Dante's people arrived within the hour. Quiet men in dark cars who moved with the efficient calm of professionals who had done this before. When the first medic reached for me to load me into one car and Dante into another, I grabbed his wrist before I'd fully decided to. "Together," I said. The medic hesitated, glanced at Dante for confirmation the way everyone in his orbit always did. "Miss, he'll be right behind you. We just need to." "Together?" I said again. Louder? My grip tightening despite the tremor in my own hand, and something in my voice must have carried enough of the last 3 days in it, because Dante looked down at my hand locked around his wrist, and something shifted in his face, some wall coming down that even the cliff and the storm hadn't fully managed. "Together," he told the medic, and that settled it. We rode to the hospital in the same car, his good hand wrapped around mine the entire way, neither of us speaking, both of us watching the coastline blur past the windows like something from another life already receding behind us, and within a day we were in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic instead of salt and smoke. Machines beeping, doctors asking questions I could barely answer through exhaustion. They separated us for treatment. Panic rose in me so fast and so absurd that I nearly pulled the IV from my own arm before a nurse gently told me he was 2 floors up, stable, resting. 2 floors up felt like another country. I saw him again, a day and a half later, through a glass panel, sitting upright in a private room with his arm in a sling, surrounded by men in dark suits, advisors, captains, silent men with watchful eyes, his world arriving to reclaim him piece by piece. An older man stood near his right side, silver-haired, dressed like money that predated fashion. Salvatore Greco, Dante's consigliere, his late father's oldest friend, the man who had helped turn a grieving 19-year-old into the coldest boss on the coast. Greco looked at me through the glass the way you look at sand still clinging to someone's shoes. Dante did not come to see me for 3 days. The first day I told myself he needed treatment. Surgery on the shoulder, monitoring for infection. That came with genuine, unavoidable delay. I filled the hours reading discharge pamphlets I didn't need, and listening to nurses' shoes squeak past my door, half convinced every set of footsteps belonged to him. The second day, I told myself he needed rest, and stopped believing it somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, watching through my open door, as 3 separate men in dark suits walked past toward the elevators without once glancing in my direction, though I knew, from the careful way none of them looked at me, that they had been told exactly which room was mine. By evening of the second day I understood. He was building the wall again, brick by brick, the way he'd built it after my mother, after Mia, the way he always did when tenderness threatened to become visible to the wrong people. Protection, he would call it if I asked. I was learning to hear that word now for what it sometimes was, distance with better manners. On the third morning, Salvatore Greco visited instead. No flowers, no apology, no warmth in his expression at all. "Miss Bianchi," he said, "how are you recovering?" "Alive? Good. Mr. Castellano insisted on the best surgeons for your injuries as well as his own. He could have insisted on visiting himself." Greco's face did not change. He is managing considerable exposure. The Alvaro group's involvement in this attack must be answered, and answered publicly, or every family on this coast will believe Castellano territory can be tested with bullets. He paused. "You should understand something, Miss Bianchi. Extreme circumstances create unusual attachments, fear, injury, isolation. These conditions can make survival feel like something deeper than it is." "Did he send you to say that?" "No, Mr. Castellano is not yet ready to hear what I am about to tell you. You, I think, are." Greco's voice did not rise, which somehow made it crueler. A man in his position cannot afford to be predictable. If it becomes known that Dante Castellano can be reached through a woman he cares for, every enemy on this coast will spend the rest of his life trying to reach that woman first. Love, in our world, is not tenderness. It is an unlocked door. You think I'm a liability. "I think you are human," Greco said, "which, in this family, makes you the single most dangerous thing in the building. You could simply say you don't like me. I don't know you well enough to dislike you, Miss Bianchi. I dislike what you represent to a man I have spent 26 years training not to need anyone." For the first time, something almost weary crossed the old man's face. His father died believing tenderness was a debt collectors could trace. I watched what that belief cost the boy who inherited it. I would prefer not to watch it cost the man as well. Maybe the belief was wrong. Maybe. Greco said. It has also kept this family alive for 3 decades. I am not eager to test which of those two facts is more true, Miss Bianchi, at Dante's expense. At his expense? Or at the expense of your own comfort? Greco's expression did not change, but he was silent a moment longer than the question warranted. You are more like him than either of you will admit, he said finally, and left before I could ask what he meant by it. He left without another word, and I sat in that hospital bed and felt 14 months of certainty crack straight through the middle. Maybe he was right, in his own cold way. Maybe the cliffs and the storm and the fever-soft confessions in the dark had only felt like truth, because there had been nothing else to hold on to out there. Maybe Dante had only been reachable because there had been no one left to punish him for it. That evening, a nurse brought my discharge folder, and a receipt slipped loose from the papers. Castellano Maritime's private medical account had covered the balance of my treatment. Beneath it, stapled to an older page I didn't remember requesting, was a second receipt. A transplant program balance paid in full 14 months earlier. Meridian Continuing Care Guarantor of Record, Castellano Family Trust. My hands went cold. Where did this come from? I asked the nurse. Billing links records under the same patient family, she said. Both accounts were flagged to the same guarantor. I assumed you knew. I had not known? 14 months of hatred had a very specific shape, and it had just been rearranged by a piece of paper I never asked to see. I was out of the bed and down the hall in hospital socks before I'd finished deciding to move. One hand pressed to my bandaged ribs, ignoring the nurse calling after me. The guards outside Dante's room stepped into my path out of habit, then stepped aside when he said, quietly through the open door, "Let her in." Greco turned as I entered, displeasure carved into every line of him. I ignored him completely. "You paid for Mia's transplant," I said. Dante's face went very still. "Sofia, answer me. All of it. 14 months ago and this week. Both of them. Was that you?" "Yes." "You let me believe you'd done nothing. You let me hate you for a sentence you were paying for in the same breath you said it." "Yes." My voice broke around the word "why," and Greco stepped forward, murmuring something about privacy, and for the first time since I'd known him, Dante's voice cut across the older man without hesitation. "Leave us, Salvatore, now." Greco left. The door closed softly. The room smelled of antiseptic instead of pine and smoke, and the coast felt suddenly, terribly far away. "Do you have any idea," I said, my voice shaking now, "what it does to a person to hate someone for 14 months and then find out the hatred was aimed at the wrong version of them?" "I know exactly what it does," Dante said, quiet. "I have hated a version of myself for 14 months too, Sofia, the one who said that sentence. I don't get to stop being him just because I also paid a hospital bill in secret. Both of those men are me. I don't get to keep only the one that's easier to live with." That silenced me more effectively than anything else he could have said. "Tell me," I said finally softer. Dante looked down at his bandaged hand. There were men in my office that day who had already turned a member of my own staff into an informant for a rival family. If I had shown you concern in front of them, a day off, an advance, anything visible, I would have confirmed that you mattered to me. And men who know what matters to me know exactly where to aim. So you chose to humiliate me instead." "I chose badly." His eyes came up, raw, steady. "I know. Stop saying you know." "I cannot stop knowing it, Sofia. I have known it every day for 14 months. In every stairwell you thought I never noticed. I went cold. You knew about the stairwell. I have known for 3 months. His jaw tightened. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself you would come to me if it mattered enough. I was wrong about that too. I watched you disappear onto that landing before every board meeting and told myself it was grief or stress or something ordinary, because the alternative, that you were being hurt in a building I owned, and I had done nothing, was more than I wanted to look at directly. You could have asked. I was afraid, he said, that if I asked you would tell me the truth, and I would have to become the kind of man who acts on it in front of a room like the one downstairs. That man frightens people, Sofia. He frightens me. I stepped closer, tears burning now, 14 months finally breaking loose all at once. You do not get to protect me by disappearing and call it strategy. You did it in your office. You did it in that stairwell. You are doing it right now, standing there explaining yourself, instead of just telling me you were scared. I was afraid, he said again, quieter, that you would see me clearly and still choose to hate me. The room went very still. Then don't hide, I whispered. Not from me. Not anymore. It isn't that simple. My world will use you against me the moment they see what you are to me. Greco already believes it. Let them. They will test every soft place I show them. Then build better walls, I said, and stop calling the ones you already have honesty. He looked away, breathing hard through pain he would have hidden from anyone but me, and told me, finally, that Greco had called a family dinner the following night, captains, advisors, elders, to make it clear publicly that the events on the coast had been survival, nothing more, and that Castellano territory remained exactly as untouchable as it had always been. Is that what you want? I asked, for them to hear that it was nothing. He did not answer fast enough. That silence hurt more than a lie would have. Do not protect me by lying to that room tomorrow night, I said. I survived a boat crash and a gunfight and a cliff edge. I can survive the truth. I left before he could find an answer that wasn't one. The Castellano estate sat above the water behind iron gates, white stone and glass, and the particular cold beauty of money that had learned to look respectable. Men in dark suits watched me arrive the following evening. None of them stopped me. Dante must have given the order, or perhaps the entire house simply wanted to see the woman from the coastline before she was written out of the story. The dining room held 14 men when I entered. Long table, low light, wealth arranged like armor around every chair. Greco stood at Dante's right hand. Dante wore black again, a suit sharp enough to look untouchable, though I alone knew what that composure cost the shoulder still healing beneath it. His eyes found mine the second I stepped through the door, and the entire room followed his gaze. Miss Bianchi, Greco said, cool and precise. This is a family matter. Then you should not have made me part of the story you're telling about it. A ripple moved down the table. Dante's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes warmed by exactly 1 degree, the only person in the room who could read it. Greco turned to him. Dante, this must be settled tonight, cleanly, or every family from here to the strait will believe your judgment can be bought with fear for 1 week. Dante said nothing. Greco took the silence as permission. The coast created confusion, Greco continued. Gratitude, fear, dependence. These feelings are understandable after violence. But this family requires clarity. A Castellano boss cannot be led by an accident of adrenaline. One of the captains near the far end of the table, a broad gray-haired man named Rossi, who had worked for Dante's father before Dante was born, cleared his throat. With respect, Miss Bianchi, this family has survived 30 years by never letting fear or affection sit at the head of this table. It isn't personal. It is entirely personal, I said, before I could stop myself. You're discussing whether the man who runs this family is allowed to care about someone without it making him weak. There is nothing in this room less personal than that, and nothing more important. Rossi's mouth thinned, but he said nothing further. Greco's eyes narrowed. Every eye in the room turned to me. A year ago, that kind of attention would have folded me in half. Now I remembered a cliff edge and his hand slipping in mine, a storm-soaked cave, and a confession that cost him more than the bullet wound had. An accident, I repeated. Is that what I am, Mr. Greco? Yes. I looked at Dante. Is that what I am? The question did not belong to the dining room, but the entire table held its breath, waiting for his answer. Dante stood slowly, pain flashing across his face before he buried it the way he buried everything, and said, "No," one word, and the temperature of the room changed completely. Greco's jaw tightened. Think carefully. I have done nothing else, Dante said, since the coast. He stepped away from the head of the table, closer to where I stood, every man at that table watching a boss they had spent years fearing walk towards something none of them had ever seen him choose out loud. She has been hiding in a stairwell for 11 months to protect her sister's life, because a man used my own shipping schedules as leverage against her, and I did not see it, because I taught myself not to look too closely at anyone I might one day have to protect at personal cost. That failure is mine, not hers. You would risk 30 years of this family's reputation, Greco said, for a contracts director. I would risk it, Dante said, for the only person in 14 years who has told me the truth without calculating what it would cost her first. Every man at this table calculates, Salvatore. So do I. She never has. That is not a liability. It is the only honest thing left in this house. Sentiment makes a boss predictable, Greco said. Sharper now. No, I said, before I could stop myself, my voice carrying the length of that long table. Silence makes a boss predictable. Every man in this room is calling fear loyalty and calling it strength. I watched him bleed on a cliff face because his own instinct was to protect someone else before himself. That is not weakness. That is the only thing in this house I've seen that actually deserves the word. Silence hit the table like a struck bell. One of the younger men shifted as though to rise. Dante did not look at him. Sit, he said, and the man sat. Dante crossed the last of the distance to me, close enough that I could see the strain still tight around his mouth from the wound he refused to favor in front of his own men. Greco believes I will lose this family's respect if I choose you, he said quietly. For me alone, though every man at the table heard it anyway. My throat closed around the answer. Then they'll learn a new kind. His hand found mine, slow enough that I could have pulled away. I didn't. I spent my whole life making sure people feared me, he said. You are the first person who ever made me afraid of losing myself instead. I hated your silence, I said, tears finally breaking loose in front of a room full of men I had spent a year being terrified of. I hated what you let me believe for 14 months. I know. I'm still angry. Good, he said, and something almost like a smile moved through the exhaustion on his face. Be angry beside me, not away from me. Rossi, the gray-haired captain who had spoken first, looked at Greco, then at Dante, then slowly back down at his own folded hands on the table. 30 years I worked for his father, he said, to no one in particular. Never once saw that man choose anything but the ledger. He glanced up at me, something unreadable moving through his weathered face. Maybe that's why he died alone in a room full of people who called themselves loyal. No one at the table answered him. No one needed to. something in my chest held rigid for 14 months, finally let go. Not all of it. Not the office, not the stairwell, not the year I'd carried Mia's secret alone, because I believed the man across from me incapable of anything but a ledger. Forgiveness, I was learning, was not a door that opened once. It was a road, and we had only just found the start of it. But love was there too, undeniable, born out of gunfire and cold water and a storm-soaked cave. Out of the choice to stay when leaving would have been so much simpler for both of us. I loved you before I was ready to forgive you, I whispered. Dante closed his eyes for 1 second, as though the sentence hurt and healed him at the exact same time, and then he lowered his forehead to mine in front of Salvatore Greco, in front of 14 men who had spent years learning to fear the coldest boss on the coast, and none of them said a single word, because none of them knew what to do with a man they suddenly understood they had never actually known at all. 9 days after the dinner, before any of it, the foundation, the transfer, the ocean at sunrise, Dante came with me to see Mia for the first time. She was sitting up in her hospital bed at Meridian, thinner than I liked, sharper-eyed than any 19-year-old recovering from a second round of complications had any right to be. And she looked Dante Castellano up and down with the particular unimpressed thoroughness only a younger sibling can manage. "So you're the boss who made my sister cry in a stairwell for a year," she said. "Mia?" "I am," Dante said before I could finish, standing too tall for the small room, his hands loose at his sides instead of folded into the controlled stillness he used in boardrooms. "I said something to your sister 14 months ago that I have regretted every day since. I let her believe I had done nothing for you when I had, because I thought secrecy was safer than honesty. I was wrong, and it cost her a year she should not have had to spend afraid of me." Mia studied him a long moment. "That's a real apology. Most people just send flowers. Flowers don't fix 14 months. "No," Mia said, "they don't." She glanced at me, then back at him. "Are you going to keep hurting her? Or was that a one-time catastrophic failure?" "I intend it to have been the last one," Dante said. "I can't promise perfection. I can promise I will not disappear behind silence again and call it protecting her." Mia considered this with the same clinical seriousness she brought to her own lab results. "Okay," she said finally, "you can stay for the rest of visiting hours." She paused. "You're paying for the good pudding from the cafeteria, though. Not the sugar-free kind. I've had a hard year." "Understood," Dante said, entirely serious, and went to find pudding for a 19-year-old who had just extracted an apology out of the coldest boss on the coast with more ease than an entire dining room full of captains had managed in 30 years. I watched him go and felt something in my chest that had been braced for disappointment for 14 months. Finally, cautiously begin to unclench. Nico called me exactly once more, 4 days after the dinner, his voice missing all of its old reasonable calm. "You think this protects her," he said, without preamble. "You think Castellano money makes any of this clean. The board at Meridian will have questions about her file the second your name gets attached to an investigation into my finances." "Then let them ask," I said. "I'm done being afraid of paperwork, Nico." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I almost thought he'd hung up. "He won't keep you," Nico said finally, the same tired threat Adrian-shaped men always seemed to reach for last, as though cruelty were the only currency they trusted. "Men like Castellano don't love people like you. They collect them until they're inconvenient." I looked across the room at Dante. Half asleep in a hospital chair, he'd refused to leave for 2 days, his bandaged shoulder propped awkwardly against the wall, and felt nothing where Nico's words should have landed. "Goodbye, Nico," I said, and ended the call, and did not think about him again with anything resembling fear. 3 weeks later, Mia's care transferred permanently out of Meridian Continuing Care and into an independent transplant program 2 states away, funded, at Dante's insistence, through a public foundation with no Castellano name attached anywhere in the paperwork. His idea, not mine. The first time I saw him choose invisibility over control. Nico Alvaro was no longer a name anyone needed to fear. The specifics of what happened to him were never discussed at dinner, and I did not ask. Doctors said neither of us should be near open water yet, and maybe neither of us was truly ready to look at a coastline again without flinching. Mia was recovering steadily at her new clinic, furious that I hadn't told her the full story sooner, grateful in the specific, prickly way of someone who has spent years being protected instead of trusted. When Dante visited her for the second time, he brought her the good pudding again without being asked, and stood in the small hospital room, too tall for it, and told her plainly that he intended to keep showing up until she got tired of seeing him. "That could take a while," Mia had said. "I've been patient before," Dante told her, and I watched my sister decide slowly to believe him. Dante took me to the coast, not the cliff where we'd nearly died, but a quiet stretch of shoreline south of it, at sunrise, far from cameras and guards and glass-walled dining rooms. He wore a plain shirt, his sling finally gone, though his shoulder still pulled tight when he reached too far. He put something small and cold into my palm, a curved piece of scorched metal, salvaged from the wrecked boat, polished smooth at the edges by 3 weeks in his coat pocket. "Why keep it?" I asked. "Because it reminds me of the day I lost everything that made me untouchable." "No," I said, closing my fingers around it, stepping closer. "It reminds you of the day you became reachable." He looked at me, and the coldness in him was not gone, would never be fully gone. Dante Castellano had lived too long in rooms where softness got you buried, but when silence came now between us, it no longer felt like a locked door. Sometimes it was simply space, wide enough for the truth to finally breathe in. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Of you?" "Of this, of us." I looked out at the water, bright now, endless, no longer only the place that had almost taken him from me. "Yes." His hand found mine. "Good. Fear is strong." I smiled despite everything. "Use it?" "No," he said, low, certain, nothing left in his voice of the man who had once told a grieving woman that timelines didn't pause for family. "Share it." The sun climbed higher over the water, and I thought of the woman I had been, crying in a stairwell for 90 seconds at a time, certain the coldest man in the building would never once notice, let alone care. I thought of the gunfire, the storm, the cliff, the dinner table where he chose the truth in front of every man who had built his reputation on fear. He had not saved me perfectly. He had not become gentle overnight, and some nights, even now, he still disappeared behind the old walls before he caught himself and came back. But he stayed. He learned. He chose, over and over, in rooms where choosing me cost him something real. And standing there with a scorched piece of metal warm in my closed hand, I understood something I would never have believed 14 months earlier. Sobbing on a landing where I thought no one could see me. Sometimes rescue does not arrive like a rescue at all. Sometimes it stands one flight above you on the stairs, silent, listening, for far longer than you ever knew, and when it finally moves, it does not carry you out. It simply refuses from that day forward to let you stand there alone?" Mia asked me, months later, over video call from her new clinic 2 states away, what had actually changed between the man who once told me family emergencies don't pause board timelines, and the man who now called her twice a week to ask about her recovery numbers like he was personally auditing her blood work. He learned that some numbers matter more than the ones on a shipping manifest, I told her. That's not an answer. No, I admitted, watching Dante through the kitchen window, arguing quietly on the phone with a foundation administrator about funding terms he'd insisted carry no trace of his own name. It isn't. Some things you don't explain. You just watch them keep showing up, week after week, until you stop waiting for them to disappear. I still went to that stairwell sometimes, not to cry, but because habit is a stubborn thing, and grief leaves grooves in a person the way water leaves grooves in stone. Except now, more often than not, I found him there too, one landing up, waiting, the way he had for 3 months before I ever knew he was listening. Except this time he didn't stay silent. He simply asked every time, without fail, "Are you all right?" and waited for the real answer instead of the one I used to give the empty stairwell. It was never a perfect answer. Some days it still wasn't yes. But it was always true, and Dante Castellano I had learned the hard way. On rocks and in storms, and across a dinner table full of men who feared him, had finally decided that true was worth more to him than untouchable ever had been.